everybody. Raul here with Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist, guitarist, harmonica player, and vocalist, Denise Kaufman. Aloha!
Aloha, Raul.
So, starting from the beginning, many of you might recognize Denise from playing with the band Ace of Cups. And you might have seen them either a while ago or recently, which is part of what we're going to talk about. But let's kind of go all the way to the past. How did you get started in music and on bass?
I got started in music because we had a piano at home, and so I would go start playing melodies on the piano when I was 3 years old. And started taking lessons when I was about 4.5, 5. My mother loved to sing. My parents, in those days, because I'm about to be 74 years old in a couple of weeks. So we're talking, I was born in 46. So in those days, like my family would gather with other families and sit around and sing, pull out the old fireside book of folk songs and sing songs, We didn't even have a television until I was a little bit older. Some neighbors did, but music was a part of my life in that way. My dad could not carry a tune, but he loved to sing. He loved music, and he was a word person, so he remembered lyrics. My mother had a beautiful voice and had sort of been semi-professional. So I was lucky to have a musical nest to grow up in a musical family in that way. I went to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music for years on piano. I couldn't play anything now from that era, but after a while I didn't like having to play recitals and things like that. Just was really uncomfortable for me. Mm-hmm. Eventually, my mom started taking guitar lessons in San Francisco where we lived. I think it was on television, by then, with Laura Weber, who was a well-known guitar teacher. And my mom bought this old guitar, this K guitar, and she didn't last very long. She had nice fingernails. I think it didn't really work for her. But so I immediately took her guitar and started playing. And that was, the folk music era. I was like 13, 14. So I grabbed the guitar, and that was my instrument from then on. And then started playing folk music with different people, like through high school. And I would go to folk music clubs in San Francisco. There were a couple, from the time I'd actually have to sneak there because my family wanted me to be hanging out with high school kids, and I was hanging out with the San Francisco folk music bohemians. Yeah. The music was always the magnet for me.
Got you. And what led you to bass?
I didn't start playing bass. I didn't play bass in the Ace of Cups, the first iteration. I played rhythm guitar and harmonica and some sitar, which I had studied. After the Ace of Cups we went our separate ways, I moved here to Kauai in 72. And I played with different bands still on guitar. Mm-hmm. And then in 1980, but I always loved bass, and I was always drawn to bass. But, one of my really dear friend was the bass player in our band, so I wasn't going to take over, But in 1980, I got invited to be in this band, this country band. And the fellow who was putting it together, Robert Savory, he was a really good bass player and guitar player, but he wanted to work on his guitar chops. And so he said, well, I'll teach you how to play the bass. And he did. At that time, he went to California. We were on Kauai. He went to California, and he went to the factory where Music Man basses were made. Oh. And he got me a maple Music Man bass and brought it back. It was my birthday. Oh, wow. And that was a bass that I played. I still have, and I've had it since then. It was like 1979 Music Man. And then we had a gig, probably within 6 or 8 weeks of me really getting into the bass, we had a 5-night-a-week gig playing country music, which was a really good place to start on the bass. Mm-hmm. At one of the hotels here, we had this gig, and I got to play. I got to play and be in a band and sing and do all of that, put all that together pretty quickly when I started playing.
Got you. And so you continued your musical path because, again, the band, initially when Ace of Cups had got started, you guys were opening for your acts like Hendrix. I mean, just the list is countless, and a lot of things were going on, but if I understand correctly, a record label deal didn't happen, and that was kind of like okay, we're not doing this, and everybody kind of went their separate ways.
You had to have a record deal in those days to make the next step. So yeah, we didn't get that chance. Even though we sang backups for a lot of bands that were playing in those, we sang backups for the Jefferson Airplane and Quicksilver and Mike Bloomfield, and opened for the band on their first ever show, and
wow,
toured with Jefferson Airplane and played with everybody. But we had 5 women, and we all lead sang. So we have like one person to focus on. We were pretty eclectic.
Yeah.
And maybe that contributed. I don't know.
For those of us that are living through these times, and it's kind of experiencing history as it happens, and this whole scene, I mean, especially even if you look at like the electric bass is a very new instrument. Rock music wasn't existing. Again, in my house, we had a folk music book too. So when you say that, I have an image of one. But then, we started seeing like the Beatles showing up, and Elvis before that. The public doesn't realize how challenging it is and how much time you spend together with your bandmates. Any of the small personal differences, it's enough to fracture. And for all of us that were around when like the Beatles broke up, we're like, oh my gosh, how can this be? They seem so happy. Everything seemed great. But yet, and we were holding hopes. Oh, they'll get together again, I'm sure. Like, not as much as we would have hoped. But so back to your own journey, you stayed musically active, I'm taking it, throughout the years.
Yes. For a while, I lived in Kauai straight. When I moved here in 72 after the Ace of Cups broke up. Mm-hmm. I'd been here when I was 15. I came here for the summer and went to a summer program here because I was desperate to learn to surf. Yeah. And I was born and raised in San Francisco. It was really hard to learn to surf in San Francisco. In those days, first of all, the water and the waves are really heavy there. They're not exactly beginner friendly. And second of all, wetsuit technology then was not what it is today. So it was, all of that. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to come to warm water, and I was able to come here and was befriended by some amazing Hawaiians who taught me to surf. A man named Herman Kane, amazing teacher, surfing and Hawaiian culture and music. And I fell in love with the culture here because music is right at the core of Hawaiian culture. Mm-hmm. I mean, the chanting, playing, dancing, all of those things are right at the center of what the Hawaiian spirit is. And I fell in love with it. And so when the Ace of Cups broke up, I came back here. And then our original Ace of Cups bass player, Mary Gannon, followed me here. Because I came over thinking I brought my 2-year-old baby, a dulcimer, and a tent. And with one of my friends in her pop tent. And I came here thinking I would stay for a few weeks in June of 72. And I just realized I never wanted to leave. So we rented a house in the fall. And then on Thanksgiving Day, 1972, Mary Gannon, who is the bass player in the Ace of Cups, arrived on the island with my Gibson Tal Farlow guitar, my amps, my sitar, my tampura, because I had left everything, in the house. She came with 11 pieces of luggage and wasn't charged any baggage fees. That was those days. Yeah. And she wrapped the sitar in blankets and carried it on the plane. And everything arrived fine. And she arrived thinking that she'd stay for a little while. And then she never left. She met her husband, Andy, and subsequently had many more children. And she already had Talina when she came, but then she had other children here. So she's been here ever since. In the intervening years, Mary and I played sometimes as a duo. Then we were in a couple of bands together here. I played with other people here. Then I changed to bass, and I really took on the bass in 1980. And by 1983, I was playing in a band called Raja and the Curls. It was a really good band, kind of a cool rock band. I really loved it. I was the only woman in that band. Great musicians. I loved the band. I went to LA to visit a friend of mine, and Hurricane Eva hit Kauai while I was in LA. Oh, wow. My friend was conducting he was a composer who was conducting a movie score that he wrote. So, I got to watch that. And while that was happening, the big hurricane hit Kauai, and the house that I was renting at the time, the roof blew off, and so I knew I was coming back to, and also the clubs that we were playing all were destroyed in the hurricane. Mm. And I had been thinking, with the encouragement of the drummer in that band, Roger Moquin, who was a Berkeley graduate, he said, Denise, you would really like music school. You should think about that. And I was in LA, and I'd always thought about MI, or the Musicians Institute.
Yeah.
But I always, Howard Roberts started it. It was kind of jazz oriented, and that was so far beyond me. But by then they had the bass division, and they were not so only focused on being jazz players. Mm-hmm. So I went and auditioned for the school, and I got in.
Wow.
And I said, I've really just shifted to bass in the last couple of years, but they were wonderful. And they said, you should definitely come and do this program. So in March of 1983, I moved to Los Angeles and went through that year-long program on the bass, which when I graduated was like, okay, now I should start going to music school. Sort of like, I wish it had been a longer program. I could have gone around 2 or 3 times again, and right then it would have been a good idea. But I was also a single mom with a daughter, so I needed to work some.
Yeah. Well, and one of the great benefits that I've heard from people that went to MI was, if not just the education itself, because there was great value in that, but the networking and kind of being in the right place when things are happening. They're like, hey, we've got this, gig coming up. Hey, we've got this score we need to work on. We've got, you're right there, so it's. I
was such a baby on my instrument that I was not the person somebody was going to go, hey, it's a score, would you know?
Yeah.
And I was also, the school at the time had like 600 guys and maybe 4 women in the school.
Wow.
And I was older, right? A lot of people came to that school right out of high school, and that instead of college, mm-hmm. They would come to MI. But in my bass class, I was the only woman, but I was older. I was like 33,
sure.
34 at the time. So it didn't really turn my head around to be with 500 guys. They were like, brothers, yeah. Whatever. For some of the younger women, they started to feel like they were very popular.
Yes.
It was a funny place in that way.
Gotcha.
But I made a lot of dear friends personally from that program, and I got exposed to the most amazing teachers, even though I couldn't, in a sense, I probably still couldn't take advantage of what they were offering at the level that they were offering it at all. But It was still an amazing gift. So I used to go in and sit in this little teeny room. The staff, the teachers had these little like counseling rooms or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they were small. But I'd go in there and just sit on the floor, maybe at least once a week, if not more, and listen to Joe Pass teach some of his guitar students. And I could just go sit on the floor and be with Joe Pass teaching. And there were many teachers like that, Tommy Tedesco. And then Schroeder, who did the big performance classes and theory classes. Carl Schroeder was incredible. And to go into his classes, and he had a whole unit just on the Beatles. That was fantastic. Wow. So, and he was a keyboard player and pianist. And he, I think, played with Sarah Vaughan for years, but he was a dedicated teacher. Mm-hmm. So there was that time there that a lot of the professors or teachers were great, world-renowned players, some of them. And in LA, which I didn't realize. Coming from San Francisco and then Kauai and going to LA, but LA was the beginning of pay to play.
Yeah.
That's the place where it was probably, I never lived in New York, but I think it would be like that there too, where the greatest players ever come to that city. Can I tell you a little story?
Sure.
After I got out of MI, or just toward the end, I really needed to work on my reading, which I do even more so today, but in those days I wanted to keep building my skills. And there was a fellow named Mr. Valenti who was a trumpet player, and he was the conductor of the South Bay Symphony. So he lived a little south of LA, but I was referred to him to go and just work with him as a teacher. And so I would go there, and he'd be on the piano and I'd be on my bass, and we would just work on reading. Mm-hmm. And at the end of my lesson, he'd say, just stick around, and he'd pull out the real book, and he wanted to work more on his piano skills, and I wanted to. Yeah. So we would pick some tunes that weren't too difficult for me. We weren't playing giant steps or anything, yeah. But I'd play with him for an hour or two. And he told me that he had a casuals band that played around LA, weddings and bar mitzvahs and stuff. And I would be doing this after lesson session with him every week, and I started thinking, well, gee, maybe I could get a job in his casuals band if I just keep working on these real book tunes with him. And,
Sure.
So finally I got up the courage to ask him. And I said, so, your casuals band, you work a lot? He goes, oh, yeah, we do. And I said, and you have a bass player? And he goes, yeah. I said, so who's your bass player? Thinking, maybe they're, And he goes, Ray Brown.
Oh.
Ray Brown plays weddings and bar mitzvahs with you? He goes, yeah. I was like, right?
Yeah.
That's LA.
Yeah.
That was LA,
Gotcha. Wow. As we fast forward 50 years from when you guys had kind of dropped off, Ace of Cups
came together to play. I mean, we had met during the intervening years. Every once in a while we'd get together for a week together or something like that. But we got together to play in 2011 for Wavy Gravy's 75th birthday benefit for Save a Foundation. And that was a big show, and we got invited to play on, and we got together. And our record label, who at the time, we didn't even know we would be making a record, but the owner of High Moon Records, who's George Bayer Wallace, was a fan of us and had reached out to us and was willing to help us do things. And in this case, he said, if you want to play that benefit, I'll rent you a house and I'll get you set up so you can practice and play that show. Mm-hmm. So that's what we did. That was 2011 in May. After that show, three of us, so I played bass in that show mostly. I think Mary Gannon, our original bass player, played a couple of tunes on bass. I played the rest. Mm-hmm. But after that show, Mary Ellen, our lead guitarist, and Diane, our drummer, and I started getting together every couple of months to write and play for 4 or 5 days. At my house in LA, they'd come to LA, or we'd meet in Marin, and we just did that for a couple of years, and we're writing. And George, our mentor, George, who owns High Moon Records, finally started saying, I love the stuff you're writing. I love what you're doing. I think you finally need to go into a studio and make a record. Yeah. So he, none of this would be possible without George backing us and having faith in us and loving our music. So we found a producer. We actually looked for a woman producer, but we didn't find anybody that we felt was right for us. And we found our producer, Dan Shea. He and Diane, our drummer, had a long time known each other. And we went in the studio about 2015. We started working with Dan. Gotcha. And our first album came out, our first studio album came out in 2018. Okay. It was a double album with 26 tracks. Wow. And now our new one's coming out in 2 weeks. And that has 12 tracks, and then we have another one that will release in about a year that we're still working on. Got you. And that is Sing Your Dreams? Sing Your Dreams is the new one. Nice. And the first one, the one from 2 years ago, is just called Ace of Cups. I will be sharing some of the videos because there's quite an assortment. I didn't realize there were that many tunes on your debut album. That's a lot of tracks. On the first one, you mean? Yes. Yeah, it was a lot of tracks. In the whole course of our band, I think maybe we did 3 or 4 ever cover songs. We mostly had original material. And so we have a lot of material. We have enough for many more albums if we want to. And we're still writing. I discovered quite an interesting variety of tunes, and some of it may come back to some of your background with sitar, especially with like Jaima, that has a totally different feel than, for example, Feel Good. Yes. Well, when I was living in LA going to music school, I had always practiced yoga myself. My mother was a yoga practitioner, so I think I had my first teacher of yoga arts when I was 15 or 16 years old that I met in my neighborhood in San Francisco. So I'd always had my own yoga practice, but when I moved to LA to go to music school and the beach was far away and I was in school in Hollywood, some friends took me to Bikram's yoga studio in Beverly Hills, and so I started a daily practice there. And pretty soon I was teaching there. He was asking the advanced students to teach. And so when I got out of music school, I ended up teaching a lot of yoga for the next number of years as a livelihood. And music was kind of more on the back burner because I was a single mom. I couldn't take gigs that took me away. I was in a band for a while that was traveling, and that didn't work with being a mom. So yoga, being a private teacher, was something I could do while my daughter was in school, and then we'd have the evenings together. So that went on the front burner for me as a livelihood. So, and I ended up teaching Quincy Jones and Madonna and Jane Fonda and Guy Oseary and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was my student.
Wow.
Sting and Trudy both for at times. And so that all just happened. That was all word of mouth. So I was very much in the yoga world in Los Angeles. So I ended up playing bass with in the scene that is called the Kirtan scene. I don't know if you know what that is, but there's a kind of call and response chanting that is traditional in India in the yoga world. And it morphed to the West, and it very much kind of morphed in ways that the West will morph things, you know.
Sure.
So there are a lot of yoga festivals or festivals that where yoga is prominent, where there's a lot of music that is kirtan, which is there'll be somebody that will be leading the kirtan, and then the audience or the people that respond with the line. So it's a call and response kind of singing, and it can be very ecstatic, and it's kind of mantric, you know, not like it's like a lot of repeated lines. And I played with some of the like kind of leading people in that world. I recorded with CC White, who does what she calls soul kirtan. So she combines her gospel background and her church background with kirtan. And
Sure.
it's amazing. And I love playing with CC. I played a lot of shows with her and recorded her album with her. And I played with Dave Stringer, and I played with Jai Uttal, some of the people that are in that scene. So because I did so much of that music, Jai Ma is kind of my expression of my love for that energy and my feminism.
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
Yes. As we live through the world of music, as it progresses historically, also living through the changes in our country and the recognition, you know, the feminist movement, you were in the center of it. And for so many of us, I remember back in the day, from a distance, we would look towards California, and I remember I wanted nothing more than to get a Nehru jacket. I thought, oh, if I could just get that would be the coolest thing to have to wear. And when I finally did make it out to San Francisco, I priced one. I'm like, oh, I don't have that kind of money. So, okay, we'll let it go. I got a peace button instead. But moving away from that, let's talk about how you get your sound. What are you playing on, your gear?
First of all, my bassist, on the first Ace of Cups album, I played mostly my Music Man with flat wound strings. I also have a Music Man fretless. It's exactly like my Sabre, but it's fretless. But I don't play that in public. It's just like, you know. But on the album, I mostly played that Music Man, but it's got, you know, just because of the way I play, it's still kind of boomier and boom, you know, like that. So for some of the other songs, Dan and I were recording up at just the bass parts, some of the bass parts at a studio that doesn't exist anymore because of the fires in Santa Rosa. But anyway, at the studio, there was an old, like a 1960s Tele bass that belonged to Mike Dirnt from Green Day that he had given to a friend of his who had left it at the studio. And I got to play it on a couple of tracks of our tracks. And it was so growly and was just so cool that after that album, I was like, okay, I want to try and find one of those. But even though I actually did sort of find one, it was still out of my price range to get a vintage. Oh. But then I heard about this bass that is a Mike Dirnt model P bass, but it's set up like a Tele. And it was a road worn, so you can see, right? Can you see it?
Yes.
It's sort of like that.
Very cool.
And my local music store in Los Angeles, True Tone, that was able to find one. They weren't so easy to get, but they found one for me. So it's a newer bass, but it's got the vibe. So I love this bass. So
okay.
It's a Fender P bass, but it's a P bass, but it's the Mike Dirnt like signature model,
gotcha.
Which has got, you know, more sounds more, feels more like a Tele, and feels more like that bass that I played on the album that he owned, you know. And anyway, so there's that. When COVID hit, it was like we had just basically, I had just done the very last things I needed to do, and I was the last person basically on the album to finish up on our new album on Sing Your Dreams to finish up, and that was like in early March. And I was up in Northern California where we record and where we have our rehearsal studio, which is where our drummer and a keyboard player live. Yeah. And so I'd been up there for basically since NAMM. Though it was we had come down, three of us had gone to NAMM, and then I went back up, and I'd been up there since then. And then COVID hit, and my family, my son-in-law and my grandson were in Europe, and they came to San Francisco, and I picked them up. And we went to the airport in Oakland and got on a plane and came to Kauai. And that's all I brought is my bass. I mean, I had no idea how long.
Yeah, this was going to go.
I left my car in front of the house we were renting, and I left my other bass and my guitars and everything and clothes in that house.
Wow.
And that was March 16th. So the woman who owns the house that our band has rented is just so wonderful. And she had been away, and she came back, and she kind of put all her stuff in one place. And my car is still sitting there with a dead battery since March 16th. No.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so I don't have other equipment here. So when you like my little Mark bass rig that I have back here, that's what I've always kept in Kauai, which is where my family, we have my daughter and son-in-law live here. We have a little family farm that we've had since 1981, and a little organic farm. And so I always have something to play here. But my bigger gear is in our rehearsal studio in Northern California, and then I have my home base is Venice Beach, and I have some gear there too. So I'm kind of really scattered all over the. But I have my other gear. I have Epiphany head and cabinets in LA, and I have Galley and Kruger gear head and cabinets that we took on the road this summer. Last summer when we played. That was kind of my touring stuff because it's the most road.
It's sturdy.
Dependable, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I've had some of the more boutique gear. I've had a little more trouble with. I did a tour in Europe with years ago with a band called the Dorgas, and I brought this Mark bass head, and the Guitar Center said, and they told me, oh, it's going to be fine in Europe. And as soon as all you need is this little converter, and I bought this, got there, and it blew up the first day. So and I know Mark bass. They're great gear. I actually, my guru of bass is Andrew Boucher, my muse and my teacher and my inspiration. And Andrew's playing a lot of Mark bass gear, and he's loving it right now. So I'd love to get some new Mark bass gear. But this is my old stuff,
Gotcha. And do you have
as much of a gear knowledgeable person,
Sure.
So I just find something that works, and I don't exactly know how I get my sound, but when it resonates for me, I'm like, oh yeah, that feels really good.
Sure. And the wild thing, especially for me, is that with so many pieces of gear that offer you so many options, and I like to find what sounds good to me, and I kind of like to leave it there. So when we're talking about amplifiers with a lot of EQ, basses, your setup is super simple, but the ones that would have 3-band EQ and all kinds of other possibilities. Even if I have all the possibilities, I kind of work at it until I find the sound I like, and then I stop. And so I feel kind of bad that I have so many options, but I've dialed it in where I want it, and now it's just staying there.
Yeah. I can totally relate to that. And one of the things that's sort of the outcome for me of my habits in the 60s of having to get right up in front and watch and listen everybody that I went to hear or any show that we ever played, I'd be up, whoever we were playing with, I'd be right up in front, is that I really blew out my hearing.
Oh.
And so I have hearing aids. My sensitivity to the subtleties is definitely diminished.
Sure.
And so I just have to find the simple thing that works and sounds good to me, and I ask my people that I respect, okay, how does this sound? It sounds good to me. How's it to you? And then I sort of like you, I dial it in and I keep it,
You leave it there.
I always tell my up and coming friends, take really good care of your hearing. I mean, in the old days it was like, oh no, it's fine. I can stand right in front of these speakers and dance all night and listen and watch, and it's no problem, but kind of was.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's one part of the sound chain that a lot of times a lot of people don't pay attention to it, but instrument cable. Do you have a preference in instrument cables?
Of totally do. Our band uses Cordial cables.
Okay.
It's a German company, but they're in the U.S. And that I totally hear the difference in my sound. And even, with my hard of hearing, whatever. I mean, I feel like that's been the biggest boost to having a wonderful sound for me is the Cordial cables. And I'm so grateful to Mike Smith and the Cordial company. And they're a sustainable, they work for us on so many levels. First of all, sound. Even the principles of the company, the values of the company and the way they mine and their commitment to sustainability is really admirable. So for us, that finding a company whose cables make us sound good and whose values we admire, that's a huge gift. So yeah, Cordial cables, I love them.
Gotcha.
I've even a couple of different models of their cables. I have like this one, which is kind of, I don't know if you can see, it's kind of clear, and then I have these. I have a few of these, which are the Encores, and then the Cordial Encores.
Nice.
And I like the ones that have a little like a nipple that comes down, so if you accidentally pull it out, it doesn't pop on you.
Oh, okay.
Really nice feature. So yeah, I think that they're great. I mean, they do like all the opera houses in Europe, the big, they do those kind of cables, studio cables and everything. They're a wonderful company, and yeah, they've made a huge difference.
Very nice. And are you using any pedals, or are you just going straight with your amp sound?
I have a few, but I really don't use them. And maybe I will. Going last summer and sort of last year touring, there was so much to keep track of. And, and then I was trading off bass with Mary Gannon on some songs. She'd play ukulele on one, then we'd trade off basses, or it was just always, there was a lot to manage. And then I'd play harmonica. So then I had my harmonica amp and harmonica mics and everything. And so I didn't add any pedals. I mean, our guitar player had a whole pedal board and everything like that. I mean, actually, I ended up using a volume pedal more for my harmonicas, but not for my bass. So, yeah.
Nice.
It was enough for me. I mean, it was a big step for us to be touring again 50 years later.
Sure.
And, we had some gear that we brought with us, but we were always showing up at a stage where there was gear there. So then for me, just to actually tune into what was there, because we didn't, we weren't at the level of prominence that we could say, we only want this amp there.
Sure.
We like work with what's there, right?
Absolutely.
And so, I humbly just try and get the sound that I could relate to and hope that the band before me didn't change it too much.
Well, Ed, when it comes to pedals, certain kinds of music may demand it more. A lot of bands didn't use them. And I'd even fielded a question. There was some prominent rock band of the 60s, can't remember who they were, but somebody wanted to know what pedals they were using. And when I did research, they weren't using any pedals. That it was the sound of the amp, and it had kind of a distorted, growly sound to it. And it's what came out,
Yeah. When our band was first together, we had a band house. After we moved out of the Haight-Ashbury, we moved to Marin County, and we had a house up in an area called the Tam Valley. This house was overlooking a valley and a big living room. And that's where we practiced at that time. And then Mike Bloomfield was putting the Electric Flag together and asked if they could come and practice at our house every day for a couple of months before their debut at the Monterey Pop Festival. So we practiced in the morning. They came and practiced in the afternoons, and we'd practice at night in our living room. So we got to sit there and watch the Electric Flag become a band. And in those days, I was a guitar player. I was always very moved by Harvey Brooks's playing. And watching Harvey, the way the bass just grounded the band with Buddy Miles on drums, right? And so I don't think Harvey ever used any pedals to my recollection. I don't remember that. And Mike Bloomfield, I mean, really the guitarists that we were around in those days a lot were like Mike Bloomfield and John Cipollina and Quicksilver Messenger Service. John used some volume pedals and did some wah-wah kind of stuff. John was like a wolf on a guitar. That was his sound. And he had really elaborate, he had these horns that looked like giant trumpets.
Yeah.
he designed this whole system to get his sound. And Mike Bloomfield it's all in his fingers.
Absolutely.
Jimi Hendrix, when we opened for him and Golden Gate Park, they played on our gear. He just brought a guitar. He played through our twin reverb amp.
Nice.
And sounded like Jimi Hendrix,
It was all in the hands.
Yeah, it was all in his hands.
Well, and we're deep in the pandemic, but looking ahead, what plans, what projects are you guys thinking about? I mean, nothing is concrete, we know, but what's in the future, perhaps?
Well, the next thing when we get together will be to start to play live again and play some of the material that we have and finish and work. We've got our next album partly done. We have some room to add some other songs, and whether there'll be songs that we've already written that we want to that haven't been released, or whether it'll be new ones we're writing. So I think for us, recording is just because the project is partly finished, we really want to finish the next album. We went with the album that came out, our first studio album that came out in 2018. That was our first time as a band to really, really work in a studio. Dan Shea was really patient with us, and we learned a lot, and we've grown a lot. And the second album, I think, you can feel that, we can feel that, and we're more confident, and we're, so I feel like the third album, we're excited about that. So I think that's probably first on the list. And then anytime we can play live, because, we have 50 years of not getting to play live together to catch up on. So
absolutely.
We want to do that as much as we can.
Got you. And if people want to know what you guys are up to, aceofcups.com would be the best place to look?
Yes. Our website's usually pretty well kept up. If people would sign up to be in our community, we do not flood people with information, but we do let people know when gigs coming up or when something cool is coming up. So we love having our community. Obviously we're on Facebook and Instagram and things like that. But we love being in touch with our people who resonate with our music. We become friends with them. Some of them are people that heard us or heard of us in the old days, and some of them are young people that are hearing us for the first time, and are teenagers or kids, And we have grandchildren. My grandson is a wonderful musician. He just graduated from music school in England. Wow. And my daughter is a singer. My family has a music store here on Kauai, Hanalei Strings. My son-in-law is a wonderful guitarist. So, and Mary Gann and her family are all musicians and players. So we're really into group musical endeavors. We always have been. We love harmonies. We love singing with people and playing with people. So there are those opportunities, especially in the pandemic. If there are ways to get together in a socially safe way and share music, we're all for that. And music will get us through this.
I agree. And I've told so many people that if you look back at the history of human beings, whether you go back to Native Americans with a pentatonic scale and a flute, or African tribes with a tree trunk and some sticks,
What? With a gourd or a...
Yes.
Yes, totally.
The music has been a constant and persistent existence, and it is essential for us.
Yes. Neurologically, we need to play music. We need to dance together. We need to sing and chant together.
Absolutely.
Hopefully it's on fire, but if not, at least anyway.
There we go. And the business itself may have to change. That's where we see the metamorphosis. And as we look back, something that was as significant as having a label that kept you guys from having an album, so many groups are recording. Everybody sends in their sound files. They're not even in the same room anymore, and they kind of independently releasing. And there's a whole movement, but that in itself is a whole other conversation. But Denise, mahalo for sharing your story with us and all of this great stuff, folks. Make sure you stay on top of Ace of Cups, what they just released and what they've got coming down the pike. You've seen her here, Denise Kaufman on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thank you so much, Raul. Muchas gracias, amigo.
Aloha. Aloha.